Special summon one fusion monster from your extra deck that lists exactly 2 monsters as material, including Elemental Hero Neos, by sending those monsters from your hand, deck, or field, ignoring its summoning conditions. If a fusion monster you control that lists Elemental Hero Neos as material would be destroyed by battle or card effect, or shoveled into the extra deck by its own effect, you can banish this card from your graveyard instead. When most people read this card, they didn't think anything of it, because a lot of people aren't very aware, like myself, of the other Neos support out there. Yes, I had heard of like the original Neos cards, and I sort of paid attention to them as they were coming out, and obviously a lot of people are using Aqua Dolphin and Connector right now to combo off in Orcus strategies. However, for the most part, if you ask me what the best Neos fusion monster to summon with this thing would be, I wouldn't really have a good answer. However, where this card suddenly becomes a lot better is when you look at Elemental Hero Brave Neos, which only takes 1 Neos and 1 level 4 or lower monster. When you look at it with that newfound context, you can understand that Neos Fusion is basically a foolish burial that summons a monster by sending a level 4 monster to the graveyard. And you know what? That actually seems really powerful. I mean, it seems like a brilliant fusion that's not restricted to light monsters and lets you send a level 4 or lower monster, but I've been a little bit sneaky so far in this video, and those of you that know the real effect of Neos Fusion probably have already frantically typed away a comment saying that I missed something in the card text, and that's because I left out one sentence, one tiny sentence on Neos Fusion. You see, while the card does everything that I just described it does, it also has a tiny drawback, just a little drawback, that prevents you from special summoning for the rest of the turn after the card resolves. And obviously that isn't a small drawback, it's a pretty big drawback, but what's interesting, and this isn't a Duel Links discussion video, but it is sort of where it stems from, is that when I saw this card and Brave Neos added to Duel Links, I said, well, this isn't going to be good enough, because you have to play a Garnet, you have to play Elemental Hero Neos, although it's not quite a Garnet because you can still send it to the graveyard even if you draw it with the Neos Fusion. However, I figured because there was 20 card decks and because there wasn't a lot you could do if you couldn't special summon for the rest of the turn, I thought the card wouldn't be that viable, but I was very wrong. This card is all over the place and it's used to send a whole bunch of cards to the graveyard, and while the formats are very different, I wanted to talk in this video about the applications of Neos Fusion in a TCG context, just because I've seen so many creative ways that duelists have used this card in Duel Links. I actually think it might have some potential in the future for TCG strategies. This card actually has a lot of synergies with current TCG decks that don't exist in Duel Links, and while it does have that really heavy restriction, I want to talk about some of the cool ways you can use this card that maybe in the future will be a competitively viable engine. First off, just so we're all on the same page, you now know the full effect of Neos Fusion. There's nothing else that I've been hiding from you, but let's just look at Elemental Hero Brave Neos one more time, just besides its material, to understand what this card does, because it does have some effects. First, it must be fusion summoned, so you can't revive it. That's kind of a downside, but overall it doesn't matter too much. It gains 100 attack for each Neospatian or hero monster in your graveyard. Most of the time that's just going to be that one copy of Neos. I'm not really suggesting that you play this in a fully dedicated Neospatian strategy. And then also, when this card destroys an opponent's monster by battle, you can add one spell or trap from your deck to your hand that specifically lists the card Elemental Hero Neos in its text. Now there are some cards you can play that are sort of cheeky ways to get bonus effects out of Brave Neos, but I think the most likely situation is that you just play this card with the Neos Fusion, and this card can search extra copies of Neos Fusion, so it's kind of a cool thing. It sort of reminds me of when you would use Double Evolution Pill to summon Overtex, and then Overtex would be destroyed and you search another Double Evolution Pill and the cycle would just continue. And maybe in the TCG you wouldn't actually have enough extra deck space to play 2 copies of Brave Neos, but you would still have that extra copy of Neos Fusion as discard fodder for a Nightmare monster perhaps. Also keep in mind that the Neos Fusion has that graveyard effect that can protect this card from being destroyed by battle or card effects one time. That might not seem like a big deal, but in the type of decks that you're likely going to be playing this card, if you want to try it out, it's going to be more OTK based strategies. I mention this because that means if you can't quite do 8,000 damage, you at least know that your opponent's going to have to get rid of the Brave Neos twice unless they want to get hit for another 2,600. And I really mean it when I say that if Neos Fusion didn't have that one line that restricted you from special summoning for the rest of the turn, it could potentially be a very powerful, if not broken, spell card. However, because it has that line of text, you have to play it in a very different way than if it wasn't there. And it matters because Neos Fusion, if it didn't have that one line of text, would probably be a very strong starter card in decks that are already using Neospace Connector. A great great example of this is that this card probably would be insanely powerful, if not broken, in Orcus if it didn't have that restriction. It's because of this that this card really needs that restriction on it, because sending a level 4 monster to the graveyard is a huge deal. Level 4 or lower, actually, you can send anything below level 4. That's a pretty big effect that we don't see on a lot of cards. In fact, many cards that have similar effects have been hit on the Forbidden and Limited list. Foolish Burial is limited and Lavalval Chain is banned, and this card without that restriction would fall very similar to those cards, maybe more akin to something like Brilliant Fusion. However, because this card prevents you from special summoning after it resolves, it means that you have to use this as basically the last step of your combo. It's just an extra layer that you add on to your already decent board. And while the card is definitely a lot worse with this effect, instead of using it as the first thing, I don't think it's necessarily useless, and I think a lot of people are sleeping on it, especially looking at future releases. The big thing that Neos Fusion does in the TCG is that after you set up your big board, if you use this as the last card, it sets up a follow-up play for the next turn. That might not sound that important, but it actually is, because it's a break my board format. It basically has been for the last couple years. Whoever goes first sets up a huge board, whoever goes second tries to break that board, and Neos Fusion just adds one more layer of an annoying card to deal with, especially when you add that Brave Neos, which can protect itself with the Neos Fusion, and then whatever level 4 monster you send with the Fusion, you can use on your following turn. Maybe it's an Orcus monster, maybe it's a Phantom Knight monster, maybe it's something else entirely. Regardless of what you send, the fact of the matter is that it's in the graveyard for the next turn, and it's another card your opponent has to deal with. And while I don't want to talk about Duel Links for more than a couple seconds here, I do want to mention some of the early uses for this card in that format, just so you get an idea of what people are doing with Brave Neos and Neos Fusion. For example, a generic card that a lot of people send to the graveyard is something like Bacon Saver, which blocks an attack. Obviously not that strong in the TCG format, but still sort of along the same lines of what we want to think about. A card that doesn't really have a special summon effect the turn you send to the graveyard, but has a useful effect later on in the duel. A lot of other people use this in things like zombie decks or cyber darks, anything to set up the graveyard for later turns. Duel Links, when you summon this, it's pretty hard for everyone to actually OTK through that card because it has that extra layer of protection, which means a lot of times you'll be buying yourself another turn where then you can use the card you sent to the graveyard. And really keep in mind, I'm just spitballing here. I don't actually think this card is currently broken, but I want to get you thinking about some of the ways that you could use it in a TCG context. I've already mentioned Phantom Knights, but what about things in Salamangreats? You could send a Spinny to the graveyard. These are things that by sending them to the graveyard now, on your next turn, you could take advantage of their graveyard effects. Or perhaps you're playing, I don't know, you probably wouldn't play this card in Thunder Dragons, but maybe you could use this to send Eclipse Wyvern to the graveyard, and then on the next turn, banish it and add Chaos Levianeer to your hand. Once again, I'm not saying these are the exact ways that you should be using this card in the TCG if you're going to use it at all, but these are things that I'm trying to think about for the future because, yeah, on paper, Neos Fusion is just a generic Foolish Burial for a level 4 or lower monster. Yes, it has that pretty big restriction, and yes, it requires playing a normal vanilla monster. However, I still think it's worth just having in your memory bank just so that if it ever comes up in the future, you now have a card that a lot of people don't even know exists. And while I'm sure some people in the Duel Links community will take this video and be like, what do you mean this card isn't broken in the TCG? It's so good in Duel Links. And I'm sure there'll be people on the opposite end of the spectrum that are TCG players saying, well, why would you ever play this card? It clearly requires you to play some bad cards. It has a horrible restriction. But I think as someone that plays both formats semi-competitively as far as Duel Links goes and competitively as TCG goes, I can look at this card and say, you know what? It actually has some potential in the future to be a powerful card if the right deck comes along, if the right card comes along to send with this thing to the graveyard. I've made videos in the past about cards that people misjudged and cards that I've misjudged, and this might be one that in the future, if a really good level 4 monster that you can send to the graveyard exists, this might be the card to send it. And I'm not saying it will be, but I'm saying to definitely keep it in your mind just in case that happens. Anyway though, I know this isn't the most competitive discussion, but I think that cards like this are really interesting. I also think of cards like Jewels of the Valiant, which might not be good right now and might never be good, but they have the potential to have some pretty big combos in the future. Once again, it doesn't send like a level 4 monster to the graveyard, but it basically can send any card to the graveyard as long as you banish something that isn't the same attribute. That might not seem that powerful right now, but in the future it might be relevant, and that's something to just keep in mind when you're thinking of tech options for future strategies. Anyway though, I'll see you guys later. Thank you so much for watching this discussion video on Neos Fusion. I know a lot of people wanted me to talk talk about this card in a Duel Links context, but I don't think that's super interesting. I wanted to talk about what I learned in Duel Links and then apply it to the TCG landscape. I'll see you later though. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.